emergency declaration, but were afraid to ask. As we continue to serve and support our global customers and partners, Fleet Complete and Big Road continue to monitor the coronavirus situation and other topical issues affecting the industry we serve very closely. We proactively build upon the response and recommendations of government agencies and public health authorities. As part of the support effort for our customers and partners, we are to help participants of the webinar to better understand how industry issues affect you, our customers. The moderator for today's webinar is Marc Moncion. For those of you who have not listened to a previous Fleet Complete or Big Road webinar series, Marc is the Vice President of Safety, Compliance, and Regulatory Affairs at Fleet Complete and Big Road. Marc is an author and industry subject matter expert who has worked in numerous senior transportation management roles for over 25 years, including an inspector for the MTO. Marc sits on several federal, state, provincial regulatory bodies and frequently provides commentary on emerging technology, best practices, and regulatory affairs. In addition, Marc is a commercial driver license holder and can drive all types of commercial vehicles in North America. This webinar will be recorded and made available online right afterwards. If you registered but could not make it, you can still view it at no cost. So before we begin, I'll just talk through a little disclaimer. So our webinars are provided for information and educational purposes only and do not constitute legal or professional advice. We at Fleet Complete Big Road make no representation or warranties about the accuracy or suitability of any information in the webinars and related materials is provided to webinar registrants on an as-is basis. We disclaim all liability for any claims, losses, or damages in connection with the use, application, accuracy, or suitability of any information in the webinars and related materials. Fleet Complete Big Road does not guarantee, warrant, or endorse the products or services of any firm, organization, or person. The information contained in this webinar is not intended to constitute legal advice or the rendering of legal consulting or other professional services of any kind. You should not in any manner apply upon or construe the information or resource materials in these materials as legal or other professional advice and should not act or fail to act based upon the information in these materials without seeking the services of a competent legal or other professional. So with that under our belt, now I'll introduce Marc, who will take it away with the discussion points.
All right, well, thank you very much, Claire, for the warm welcome, and thank you all for joining me during the session. I want to start off just providing some discussion points. You know, we've heard the disclaimer, which is something that we have to always say. I'm then going to move on to just some personal reflections on how this COVID-19 outbreak has personally impacted me. I'm going to acknowledge all of the time and effort from our responders, the first responders, and more specifically, our truckers are making a difference in our lives. I'll take this time when I get there to make sure that you're thanking a trucker. Anytime you see a trucker, like, they are going outside the norm, and I want to make sure that you acknowledge what they're doing and all the hard work they're providing. I will explain a little bit how the social distancing protocols have impacted truckers while in transit, you know, while they're delivering goods from receivers to shippers. I'm going to provide you an update on the status of public rest areas, as well as truck stop restrictions. I'm going to provide you with some highlights as to what has emerged in terms of medical coverages and what you can expect from border crossings for the truckers that are there right now. The borders have been restricted for essential services, but truckers still can continue to use the border. I'm going to also provide some insight with respect to the National Emergency Declaration and also how it has been amended to soften up some of the goods and services that can be provided that would be captured under the hours of service exemption. I'm then going to provide some insight on how truckers, you can protect yourself from cargo insecurity and theft, because this is starting to become a bit of an issue when trucks are resting in transit. And that point on, I'm going to provide you with some of my insights. As you may have seen, I've written a few blogs on the COVID-19 outbreak, and I just want to highlight what some of those are. We're going to move on to the Q&A session. You can go ahead and start typing in your questions as we go. I'm going to only touch upon the questions when we reach at bullet 15, and then I'm just going to conclude the section, you know, on you very much and keep on all the excellent work. Please continue to encourage your fleet of drivers. If you happen to be a shipper, just look into what you can do to help out. So without further ado, I'm going to just kick this off. So welcome to everything you want to know about trucking during an emergency, but we're afraid to ask. So in terms of a personal reflection, when COVID-19 first came on everyone's radar, including myself, in early March, I was actually in transit to Chicago on a business trip. At that time, I just landed in Chicago at O'Hare Airport. It was kind of like business as usual. I thought about the risks associated with continuing this business travel, and at the time I elected that it was worth the risk to proceed. By the time I arrived at the hotel, things started to evolve very, very quickly. Do I stay in Chicago? Do I go back home? At the end of the day, I ended up spending most of my time in my hotel room, except for attending the meetings really around the world that had showed up for these meetings. And we all, as a group, elected to maintain our social distancing. And we talked about having to be quarantined upon our return. And for me, I ended up Friday the 13th of all times. I returned home. I ended up getting up at 4:30 in the morning. I literally took the first plane out, and things were rather quiet. I landed back in Canada, and it was my wife who actually shared me some pictures of the flood of passengers later on that day at Chicago O'Hare Airport. And really, every international airport were just flooding with people, and there was no social distancing. You could see people were all together. It was kind of like panic, wanting to get back to their home place to be safe and begin their quarantine. I myself have returned home. I've been personally quarantined for the last 14 days, and I continue on this quarantine just to ensure I'm not either being susceptible to the outbreak or sharing any viruses with anybody. On another personal note, my daughter, my son, his girlfriend, they're all frontline healthcare workers. I'm sure you can appreciate there's a certain level of anxiety for me knowing that they're at a heightened level of risk. They're doing it because in their mindset, their DNA is to help people out. They commend for them all the time just to make sure everything's okay. I can't help about thinking about them while they're in the hospitals and the clinics. That really got me thinking about other frontline workers that are integral to the safety of everybody. Doctors, nurses, paramedics, the Army, ambulances. They all play an integral role in our health and safety as well as the public, and they're constantly being acknowledged for their efforts, and I commend them for that. I then went on to thinking about other types of frontline professionals that are making a difference in our lives. And that takes me, of course, to our road nights. Those are the truckers that continue to deliver goods as an essential service. I personally come from the trucking industry. I've been surrounded by trucks my entire life. I have family members that are involved in trucking as well. And I think about the crucial role they have played as well. Moving goods is so integral in supporting the supply chain from point of origin to when the goods show up. Up until this outbreak, they were not always quickly acknowledged for being the road night professionals that they are. Well, if you follow social media now, you will notice the steady stream of thank yous that are being sent by numerous people to the trucking industry. This is really their time to shine, and they are shining. Make no mistake with that. They are delivering as promised, but they have some challenges that they have to overcome. And you will note what some of these challenges are. Hands down, they are the backbone of the supply chain when it comes to ensuring that goods and services keep on moving to protect us all from this outbreak. I want to personally thank all the truckers who supply all the goods and services, and I'm going to commend you for doing the same thing. Thank you to our drivers. Without you, everything would grind to a halt and chaos would likely ensue. Like many of you listening on this call, I've also been glued on the TV. I've been watching the news that is unfolding. I'm also well connected in social media. I'm on Facebook, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter. If you want to connect with me, please do so. We have seen how truckers are overcoming the challenges on a daily basis to move the freight. There has been a big spike in the volume of traffic. They want to keep the shelves stocked. Anyone who's gone grocery shopping, gone to retail outlets, you see that this is an ongoing challenge to keep the freight moving. On that same note, it breaks my heart when I read stories of truckers who are picking up and delivering freight in response to the outbreak, and they're not always, they have to live with the social distancing. They're all alone. They're away from their families. Some of them have some anxiety. They worry a little bit about their health. They're there moving freight for us. In some cases, they go to some locations. I'm sure you've all heard the term, hurry up and slow down. Well, here it's now hurry up, stay in your truck and wait and slow down. These truckers are being asked, they're instructed to stay in their trucks while the freight is getting unloaded. Shippers and receivers are then going to their trucks to get the bills of lading and their waste manifest signed. They're trying to keep some social distancing. I get all this social distancing. I'm doing it myself. But at the very least, please allow drivers to use the washroom facilities, porta potties, anything you have. I'm sure you can appreciate that they just can't drive their tractor trailers and park on the streets to find a restroom. If these shippers and receivers don't allow them to use their washroom facilities, when nature calls, they're going to go. I've heard of stories also, shippers and receivers not allowing truckers to stay on their properties after the load has been unloaded. They are the partners in the distribution process. Without truckers, you wouldn't have any freight to unload, and they wouldn't have any freight to share with their final mile customers. So I'm hoping that they would at the very least have them use the restroom facilities so that they can actually have a little break. I've also heard stories and read stories, as you may have as well, about public rest areas being closed. In certain states, they have shut down altogether. They have reduced in some other areas. Again, I'm going to, state about the social distancing. I get all that, staying away from each other, not congregating. But on the flip side, truckers are mandated by regulation, by the hours of service regulation, whether they exempt under the declaration or not, they still need to find a place to rest. All drivers, they're supposed to safely stop. They have to take a minimum half-hour rest before the 8th hour. On the 8th hour, on the 11th hour of driving, they again have to take 10 hours off. The same thing for 14 hours on duty. Some over-the-road drivers on long haul, they have to break up their rests in 2 sleeper berth periods. You've heard of the long rest of 8 hours and the short rest of 2 hours. Other truckers have to take their 34-hour reset to restart their cycles. Reading stories being cited for parking their rigs in unauthorized parking spaces because they're not open rest areas where they can rest. On the flip side, I'm talking to truckers, please ensure if you are granted the privilege of resting on someone's private property, please take your trash with you. Don't throw any yellow bottles in the ditch or by the side of buildings because you will quickly lose your privilege. These public rest stops in transit are the lifeline for truckers to not only comply with hours of service, if they're not covered by hours of service by this emergency declaration, they still need to get rest. So they are on alert. We want them alert when they're driving. We don't want to see a spike in accidents because we got fatigued drivers that continue to drive. Use some common sense. If you're tired, stop. Preventing truckers from finding a safe place to sleep in their trucks and use restroom facilities only makes their job that much more challenging. Why? We know truckers want to bring everyone the goods and services they need to survive. I've read in some states, including in Pennsylvania, where they have now reversed this decision. They've opened some of the rest areas for truckers, but not all. It's a point in the right direction, but more needs to be done. The same thing with respect to people who operate truck stops on the highways and crossing borders. On the highways, I understand these truck stops are required to comply with emergency declarations. Some of them have closed their truck stops. What this means is truckers no longer have a place to sit down or to congregate. Now truckers, some can go in and they have a drive-through as long as they can accommodate a tractor trailer configuration. They're not allowed to sit down and have a hot meal though, but other truckers at this truck stops, they've allowed truckers to get meals, but they won't let them in the restrooms or they won't allow them to use their shower facilities. I get this social distancing stuff, but we need to allow truckers to have a reasonable location to stop and have a shower and have a bio break. The next one, of course, like we've seen some truck stops have adjusted. See this picture? They are bringing food to the truckers, and I commend these out-of-the-box truck stops that have gone beyond the call of duty. They recognize that truckers are the lifeline of the industry. So the next big challenge, and you'll see it, is for those of you that operate interstate or you go across from Canada to the United States. In some cases, some companies are not allowing, through their insurance company, their policies are not covering for COVID. I understand there's some risks associated with providing insurance coverage for truckers, but on the flip side, these truckers have supported insurance companies for years through their paid insurance premiums. Not getting proper medical coverage is just another challenge that truckers will have to overcome to deliver their goods. So please, insurance companies, give them a bit of a break. I also understand that as long, I've heard in the last days or so, as long as drivers have not displayed any COVID-19 type symptoms when entering either country, be it Canada or the United States, that insurance coverages for COVID-19 will be honored. What I'm going to say, though, is you should reach out to your insurance providers to get some kind of written assurance that you are going to be covered outside of your country, because as you can appreciate, this will get very expensive. You've also heard that some non-essential services between Canada and the United States has been restricted at the border. Well, thankfully, these restrictions do not apply to truckers that are traveling north-south. The other real positive in all of this is truckers who, and we know on both sides of the borders, we have a lot of foreign workers that come into Canada and the United States that work for trucking companies, and there's been assurances that when they're traveling across the border, that they will continue to be allowed to enter and leave their home jurisdiction as long as they have not contracted the virus. These truckers will also continue to be exempt under the 14-day self-quarantine rule and will be allowed to cross the border between Canada and the United States. With that being said, I'm going to ask that you please use some common sense. Truckers, I know your superpowers to move freight, but you're not immune from contracting the disease. So please continue to follow these social distancing protocols. I know it's easy to do when you're in your trucks, but once you leave, you get out of your truck, maintain that distance. You want to protect yourself. You want to protect yourselves and your families and your fellow road knights on the road. So the next thing I want to do is I just want to move on to the National Emergency Declaration. And this was really put forward by President Trump in the US and was followed suit by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. There's a specific list that originally were exempted for truckers for hours of service, provided they were providing direct assistance to the relief. If you haven't heard it, it's the medical supplies, equipment related to the testing, diagnosing, treatment of COVID-19. Some of the supplies and equipment, they include masks, gloves, hand sanitizers, soap, disinfectants, all these things that are necessary for healthcare workers, patients, community safety, sanitation, and really preventing the spread of COVID-19. Next was food for emergency restocking of stores. A lot of questions about what type of food. You're hoping that the inspectors at roadside, because the scales are still going to be open, if the scale lights are flashing, don't bypass the scale. They're going to ask you to see, your bills of lading, your manifest, to see exactly what you're transporting. So food, as you know, is a very general term, and the US government has tightened or made it more prescriptive as to the types of goods, and it's really opened it up for you guys. There's also equipment, supplies, persons necessary for the establishment and management of temporary housing and quarantine facilities for COVID, persons designated by the federal, state, or local authorities for medical isolation or quarantine purposes, as well personnel who provide medical or other emergency services. There's been a lot of communication from trade associations on both sides of the border and has resulted in an expanded list. So now these new products will include still food products, but is expanded to now paper products. For those of you who have gone to retail outlets, you'll know paper products have really been strained in the supply chain. So those that are transporting such goods are also exempt. Other groceries for the emergency restocking of distribution centers or stores. The next is the immediate precursor of raw materials. These include paper, plastics, or alcohol that are required to be used for the manufacture of essential items. The next good is fuel. So how are we going to allow our road knights to keep on moving goods in the United States if fuel haulers are not able to refill all of the truck stops? So fuel has now been expanded as a list of exempt items. Also expanded is the direct assistance. There's been a greater definition for that. It also does not include the transportation of mixed loads. So some motor carriers have LTL freight, where they have some freight that is direct relief and others that are not direct relief. Well, the US government has provided an additional definition to call it if you have a nominal quality of goods that are qualifying to go beyond what's defined as nominal. So you may want to speak to your employer, your customers, any shippers that you deal with to confirm what is deemed to be nominal going forward. But we'll talk about that in greater detail as we move forward. Much like healthcare workers, truckers have it in their lifeblood to move people, and they will continue to navigate this outbreak. The next thing I really want to talk about, and it's something that I'm reading increasingly about, is cargo security and theft. As you know, if you've been a trucker, it can be a dangerous job. Truckers face the road alone. It's all, often in harsh weather conditions for weeks at a time. This new trend, people, when they see that the shelves are empty, if they know you're carrying a certain product that they're lacking, this can open the potential for cargo theft. So I just want to offer you 3 easy ways you can prevent this. Number 1, you want to pay attention. The most important thing truckers can do is always pay attention to your surroundings. It sounds obvious, but keeping your eyes peeled for odd things can save your life and your cargo. If you're on the road, keep a close eye on your mirrors. If you notice someone's following you, even after several nonsensical turns, you can consider calling the police and your fleet. If you're near a gas station, a police station, or other location, pull on in. Park where someone can see you and call for help. Be aware while your truck is parked too. As you know, there's several truck stops that have surveillance cameras pointed towards them. Take advantage of that. Keep your truck in sight of cameras. If something happens, this footage may be the difference between finding out someone's license plate and stopping a cargo ring of theft. Investing things such as padlocks, other security measures to protect yourself. Even when you and your cargo make it to this destination, you can still be subject to threat. Like I've been reading people actually getting their trucks stolen. So you want to verify with your drop-off points. You want to understand your load's thresh level. Certain types of commodities are highly sensitive or highly wanted. There's certain freight that people will do whatever they can to get their hands on. High-risk loads, electronics, food, beverages, paper products. You may want to consider taking routes in which you can avoid these high crime areas if possible. Investing in technology, you want to be able to communicate at all times using technology. So just a few things, if you're running a fleet, using your GPS, your tracking technologies, just to make sure your company knows where you are at all times. This will go a long way to mitigating theft. So investing in technology as well. We have some amazing GPS technology with Big Road, letting you know where you are at all times. So I just want to move on. If you haven't seen this, that talks about some of the emergency declarations. I put this blog together. There's basically 10 key questions that I want to go through. I really want to write these blogs. This is my small contribution to trying to make a trucker's life easier. I hope you've had a chance to read them. If not, they can be found at the Fleet Complete and Big Road sites. You just have to click the 2 blogs, ask the expert. These blogs understand how this outbreak is affecting you as a trucker. They let you know what you can and cannot do based on what you're hauling and where you're going. And I'll go through the highlights of some of these blogs. If you haven't If you have any questions, though, you can certainly write them down. I see there's a couple already pinging me here. If I don't have the answer, I will research it. I'll make a point, my commitment. I've been in this industry for almost 30 years, so many questions I'll have the answer to. That being said, these are new times for everybody. And this is a live Saturday Night Live listening. So this is filmed in front of a studio audience. So I'm asking you, if you can, keep your questions specific to COVID-19 and not any other general trucking questions. But that being said, if you have any questions specific to trucking, you can certainly reach out to me at Ask the Expert, and sky's the limit. I can talk about anything. If it involves a truck or a driver, I'm very passionate about it, and if I can help you, I will definitely help you in any way I can. You can just go to the Fleet Complete or Big Road home pages, and it'll take you exactly where you can find me at Ask the Expert. Alternatively, today you can ask your questions, and the same thing for Big Road. We have their sister companies, so you can ask me at that site as well. So I just got a couple of questions here. I'm just looking at We Haul Meat. Can you tell me if anything has changed? Would it be under emergency declaration? Well, meat is certainly something which is providing nourishment. It's providing food to our clients, our customers. So the answer is yes. It's food. It's clearly listed as part of the exemptions, as long as you're not carrying a mixed load. So if you're LTL, non-LTL, you'd be exempt if you had only the meat. But if you're doing LTL and you're dropping several other commodities and it's listed on your manifest as not being directly relating to the emergency, then that would not apply. Next question is, does this emergency apply to interstate trucking? Yes, it does actually apply to interstate trucking, provided that you are providing direct relief to the industry. If not, then the same rules apply. And what gets challenging is for motor carriers when they are hauling exempt commodities and then hauling non-exempt commodities. This is why it's key that you want to continue. If you are a Big Road customer, even though you're moving some exempt goods, you still want to keep track of the driver's hours. Under exemption, you're not required to surrender anything to the officer at roadside if stopped, but you want to clearly have your drivers keep on using the technology, because Murphy's Law, when you're moving a non-exempt load, that's likely when you're going to get stopped. And then you're stopped as a driver, owner, operator. You advise the inspector that you've been moving loads of emergency declared goods, but this happens to be a load that's not exempt. That would not comply in today's world, and you would still need to meet Part 395 of the Hours of Service Regulation. I have another one here. Is there a list of truck stops that are staying open or closed so drivers don't waste time and energy going somewhere that is shut down? Yeah, as a matter of fact, Mr. Church, thank you very much for that question. I've provided a list of restaurants. If you go on the blog, and it will explain, see, I'm going to click this blog here, and there's a site below that will give you a list of locations. If you look at bullet number 16, what about the news of some states shutting down all dine-ins or restaurants at truck stops? So depending, Mr. Church, and what jurisdiction you're in, just go to the blog that I've provided here and look at the jurisdiction where you or your drivers are hauling, either intrastate or interstate, and it'll provide some information on the types of restaurants and what are some of the limitations and the time periods where they're open. So hopefully that was of use as well. Let's see, I got some more here. With hauling meat, how would I run my logbook after I run out of hours? Well, Miss Kerstetter, I hope I pronounced your last name properly. If you're hauling meat, you're exempt from the emergency declaration. So if you're using the Big Road solution, going back to the blog I wrote, you merely have to go in the settings section as a driver, and you merely have to assign yourself emergency declaration. You click on that box. You will then be prompted to explain what exemption under emergency you're providing. You enter that information down, and you will be exempt under the hours of service regulation. And you could continue running your log, but the difference is you'll never have a violation. The violations are suspended during the time where you're on this emergency. Now, the challenge, of course, is once your emergency is done, you can return empty, or if you're a driver and you need 10 hours off, you let your back office fleet director, manager, whomever you dispatcher, whomever you report to, letting them know that you are tired, and they must grant you a full 10 hours of off-duty time. Once you've completed your 10 hours of off-duty time, if you're assigned another emergency run, say hauling meat again, you can continue being exempt. I'm going to suggest you annotate exactly what's taking place during these emergencies, and once this COVID situation hopefully runs its course, if you are ever subject to a safety review down the road, you want to document everything you're doing. So please protect yourself. There's a section to remark all of the annotations. On the flip side, if after you've taken your 10 hours of rest, you are then sent a non-exempt load, right? This is why it's so important you want to keep track of your hours, because what you've done during the emergency will not count towards your hours of service. But clearly, once you are non-exempt, if stopped at roadside, the officer is going to want to know what you're doing at that point in time, and every change of duty status up until you have been stopped. You must now comply with the regulations in terms of your 11-hour driving, your 14-hour on duty, taking a half-hour break by the 8th hour, complying with your 34-hour cycle resets. These are all very important. Next question from Aaron. Do you have to have a waiver from the shipper when shipping food? Will they want to see a waiver at a road inspection? Well, that's a very good question. There are no actual documentation requirements to be surrendered at roadside. That being said, I have come across some specific language that has been written by employers that describe that a certain driver is moving goods on behalf of a specific shipper, and in those instances, they are under an emergency declaration. Now, that being said, the officer may not accept it, but it's certainly going to help you when stopped at roadside. Anything you can provide the officer to take away the debate at roadside will be helpful. Next one is, how do we know exempt or not exempt? Well, essentially, you're exempt when you are hauling goods on a priority basis for direct relief, and it includes the goods that I've specified earlier on in my presentation. When you're exempt, that applies to the hours of service. Requirements are no longer applicable to you. But when you are not exempt, Mr. Contreras, then you must fully comply with the regulations. Next one, is the Prime Minister and provinces aware of these shutdowns? I'm not sure, Mr. Church, what you mean by these shutdowns. You'd have to be more specific because I don't know what that means. The Prime Minister, of course, and the provinces are working very closely with the United States to remain open for the safe transfer of goods between both countries. So in terms of shutdowns, and perhaps you're talking about rest stops. Again, I'm not sure if that's the case. What is key in this whole scenario is we are dealing with situations that are very unusual. So what if I'm interpreting your question properly, Mr. Church, I'm going to suggest you annotate specifically what in the remarks section, what has been shut down in terms, say, of a mile marker. You can perhaps consider using, if you're moving a non-exempt good, you can use the 2-hour adverse road conditions, but please, you always have to remark the section to annotate specifically what has taken place. Mr. Contreras, another question. What are the hours of operation during the exemption, emergency exemption? Well, Mr. Contreras, there are no hours of operation for exempt operations. So if you're moving goods for direct relief, including the goods that you are transporting, then that would qualify for the emergency hours of service exemption, and you are not required to comply with the rules under hours of service. If not, then you would fall back to regular hours under Part 395 in the United States. Question for Mr. ATAC or Mrs. ATAC, I'm not sure, I think if it's a male or female. Would delivering mushrooms to grocery stores for restocking be considered exempt? Again, that would fall under the emergency food declaration that I talked about earlier. And if that's the case as you described, it's food. It's food for the restocking of shelves. So I would say yes. Those are all great questions, folks. I have another one here. If I haul auto parts and then switch back to meat, do I need a 10-hour break in between? Well, it depends if the load of auto parts falls within the description of what is an exempt commodity for the purposes of providing goods to its destination. If no, then the load of auto parts would be requiring the driver to comply with the rules. And once you switch over to the meat, I'm definitely not sure what you're doing in the day. If you've hit your maximums in terms of drive time on duty time, if you've taken the 30-minute rest by the 8th hour, then clearly you need a 10-hour break before switching on to the meat. Because if not, then you've kicked off your day before having the required rest time. A lot of it is going to be common sense as well. Can you have back-to-back emergency loads? Absolutely, Mrs. Lopez, you can have back-to-back emergency loads. You want to ensure, notwithstanding the emergency declaration, no one wants to have fatigued drivers behind the wheel because you're going to deal with some liability issues. If a driver tells you, it's all communication. If a driver tells you, look, I've just hauled a load to a certain location, I need 10 hours rest to reset my clock, my circadian rhythms are off, I need to rest, I don't want to fall asleep behind the wheel, then please grant the driver the time needed to get their rest. Make sure they annotate it in the remarks section. But yes, certainly a driver can have back-to-back emergency loads. I've had a question if a motor carrier needs to have approval from the FMCSA. There's no approvals that are needed. Only carriers providing direct assistance to the emergency relief as defined in regulations can participate. Another point may not be applicable to anybody, but just so you know, if for whatever reason, perhaps a safety evaluation was done, a safety audit done at your place of business, or a driver has been placed out of service for going over their hours when not exempt, if a driver is out of service based on the exemption, they cannot participate in this emergency relief because they're out of service. One about how do I know what emergency declarations are in effect at any given time? Well, I'm going to recommend very strongly, I'm going to keep on putting blog posts. That's my commitment to help out in any way I can. But really, if you look at the FMCSA, they're providing periodic declarations. The emergency list has changed. The types of goods have changed. This could be subject to some additions or omissions depending on what they see. There's also some regional emergencies based on Part 380.23. These are all typically for 30 days or more, but given what's taking place with COVID-19, it's not unreasonable to expect that this emergency may and likely will go beyond the exemption deadline. I've got another one here from Dina. If you're hauling dairy products such as milk and having not enough time to make the delivery when driving under the regulations, can I continue to drive until making to the receiver under emergency relief? Well, if you're hauling dairy products such as milk, that's a consumer product that's needed to be populated on the shelves for consumers to consume as part of the relief effort, so you would not be required to comply with the hours of service regulation in that case. Now, another one here is what specific federal regulations. Many are focused on hours of service, but it doesn't just apply to hours of service. There are other emergency exemptions to regulation from this. You know, anything pertinent to vehicle maintenance inspections and other general documentation, driver qualifications. And there's a link to the FMCSA which describes what regulations would be included and which would not be included. That being said, there are some regulations that are not exempt by the emergency provisions. Those are very specific. Drivers and motor carriers have to comply with the controlled substances and alcohol use and testing requirements. This is under Part 382. There's also commercial driver licensing requirements. So in other words, if you're a passenger driver, you can't just jump into a tractor trailer because it's an emergency. There's the minimum levels of financial responsibility requirements. Those continue to apply under Part 387. And there's also the hazmat requirements as well. Those continue to apply, and that's based on Part 100 through to Part 185 of 49 CFR. Next thing need to know is this, it doesn't exempt drivers from things like license plates. It sounds pretty common sense, but license plate, taxes. If you're running over-dimensional loads, you would still require an over-dimensional permit. You know, some specific states may exempt, but you'd want to, you may want to just cross-reference with your state location on that. I have one. Can you please explain how I choose emergency declarations? Certainly. So if you go under the Big Road site, and again, I'll click on it here, it shows you, we have a little area, it's in the, you just go into the basic site where you can just click on it. And in the settings, you click on it, you click emergency declarations, and it'll enable the emergency, and you just have to enter the reason for enabling the emergency. And once you click select, you'll see that the dials, as you're seeing on the screen, will change to red, meaning you are exempt from the requirement. So hopefully that has, you found that of use in answering your question. Oop. On the Big Road app, is there a specific area we need to go and set up as an emergency hours, or can we just drive off duty and make specific notes on each trip? You could do it both ways, Montgomery, but probably the easiest way to do this is just to declare the emergency, and that's probably your best bet. Any other questions, folks? Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for joining me today. If you do have any further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me at Big Road. You go on the site and just click on Ask the Expert. You can type in your question and you're able to get on the site, ask me anything pertinent to either COVID or anything else specific to what you have questions about. So I want to thank take this time to thank you very much, and I look forward to chatting with you again. Have a nice day.